Some women leave you flowers or letters or a piece of jewelry you will never take off. Mine left me a restaurant in Vermont, and a reservation she made 18 months before she died, knowing I would be too stubborn to find my way back to living without one. My name is Tom Ellison. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years cooking in professional kitchens, the last 12 of which I spent not cooking at all. My wife Grace got sick, and I put down my knives, and I told myself it was a choice. It was not a choice. It was the only thing that made sense when the person you love most in the world needs you in a different way than she used to. Grace died on a Thursday morning in July. She had been fighting Parkinson's disease for 5 years, which means we had 5 years to prepare. And I was somehow still not prepared. That is the particular cruelty of a long goodbye. You think the time is a gift, and it is. But it does not make the last morning any easier. It just means you have had more time to memorize the exact sound of her breathing, so that when it stops, the silence has a very specific shape. The funeral was on a Saturday. I wore a gray suit Grace had picked out for me 3 Christmases ago. She had handed it to me in the box and said, "Tom, when you eventually need this, I want you to look like someone who was loved well." I had laughed at the time because that is what you do when your wife says something that breaks your heart a little while also being completely practical. I did not laugh when I put it on that Saturday morning. I just stood in front of the mirror for a long time, making sure I looked like someone who had been loved well. Our son Mitchell flew in from New York on Friday evening. He is 39 years old and works in finance, which means he is very good at assessing the value of things, and occasionally forgets that not everything has one. He arrived with a rolling suitcase and a firm handshake and the particular expression of a man who has already decided how he is going to manage this situation. I recognize the expression because Grace used to make it too, usually right before she reorganized something I thought was perfectly fine. The service was held at St. Michael's Church on Meeting Street. Grace had attended that church for 22 years. The pews were full. She had that effect on people, the kind of woman who collected genuine friendships, the way other people collect acquaintances. The pastor spoke for 20 minutes about grace in its broadest sense, which I found either very fitting or very on the nose depending on how you looked at it. Mitchell sat beside me in the front pew. He is tall, broad-shouldered, with Grace's eyes and my jaw, which is a combination that makes him look permanently like he is about to ask a question he already knows the answer to. He kept his hands folded in his lap throughout most of the service. Composed. Controlled. The kind of grief that has already been organized into something manageable. I noticed he checked his phone twice during the eulogy. I said nothing. Grace always told me I noticed too much and kept too much of what I noticed to myself. She said it the way you say something that is both a criticism and a compliment at the same time. I am starting to think she was right on both counts. After the service, people gathered in the church hall. Someone had arranged trays of food. I ate none of it. I stood near the window and shook hands and accepted condolences and said thank you so many times. The words stopped sounding like words. Mitchell worked the room with the efficiency of someone running a meeting. I watched him from across the hall and thought, he is handling this. And I was not sure if I meant it as a compliment. We drove back to the house on Trad Street in separate cars. That was not intentional. It was just how it happened. Mitchell had his rental. I had my truck. And somehow that small logistical fact felt like a larger statement about something I could not quite name. I unlocked the front door at 4:30 in the afternoon. Mitchell came in behind me, loosened his tie, and said he needed to make a few calls. I said, of course. He went upstairs. I stood in the front hallway for a moment. And then I walked to the kitchen. The kitchen of our house on Trad Street is the room where I have spent the better part of my adult life. 31 years of professional cooking, and still the room I came back to every evening was this one. 12-foot ceilings, wide plank floors. The cast-iron skillet Grace's mother left her hanging on the wall above the stove. I know every corner of that kitchen the way you know a person you have lived alongside for a very long time. I stood in the doorway and looked at it. The stove was cold. The counters were clean. Someone from the church, I think, had washed the dishes that had been in the sink that morning. Everything was exactly in its place. The cast iron skillet hung where it always hung. The knife block sat where it always sat. The small ceramic bowl Grace kept by the sink for loose change and hair ties and the random debris of daily life sat exactly where it always sat, still half full of her things. I stood there for a long time. Then I turned around and walked to the living room and sat down in my chair and looked at the wall. The kitchen was the same as it had always been. That was the problem. Everything was exactly the same, and Grace was not there. And those two facts together were the loudest thing I had encountered in 64 years of living. I did not cook that evening. I did not eat. Mitchell came downstairs around 7 o'clock, ordered Thai food on his phone, left a container on the kitchen counter for me, and went to bed at 9:30 because he had an early flight back to New York on Monday. I sat in my chair until almost midnight. Then I went to bed too. The kitchen stayed cold. The days after Grace's funeral have a way of blurring together that I was not prepared for. People talk about grief like it is a single large event, something you go through and then come out the other side of, changed, but intact. What they do not tell you is that it is mostly just Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then another Tuesday that feels exactly like the first one. Except now, the sympathy casseroles in your refrigerator have started to smell questionable. I received 11 casseroles in the first 2 weeks. I counted them because counting things gave me something to do that was not thinking. 11 casseroles, 4-pound cakes, 2 fruit baskets, and 1 very ambitious lasagna from a woman at the church whose name I could not remember but whose handwriting on the note was extremely confident. I ate almost none of it. I would open the refrigerator, look at the stacked containers, and close the refrigerator again. This happened approximately 4 times a day, with the mechanical consistency of a man who has confused activity with purpose. My neighbor Carol Simmons came by on the 3rd day after the funeral. Carol is 65 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with excellent intentions and a complete inability to read a room. She arrived at 10 in the morning with a pound cake and the energy of a woman who had decided that what I needed was company, regardless of whether I had been consulted on that decision. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, which I had been avoiding, and clasped her hands together and said, "Tom, honey, what are your plans?" I looked at her over my coffee cup. "Carol," I said, "I buried my wife 8 days ago." She nodded seriously, as if I had said something that required consideration. "I know that," she said. "I was just thinking, practically speaking, about the house. It is a lot of square footage for one person." I told her the house was fine. She brought me another pound cake the following Thursday, which I interpreted as either an apology or a second attempt at the same conversation. It was a good pound cake. I ate 3 slices standing over the kitchen sink at 11 o'clock at night, which is how I knew I was not doing well. Carol came back on the 9th day, and again on the 14th. By the 3rd visit, she had stopped bringing food and started bringing what she described as practical suggestions, which is a phrase that has never once in the history of human language preceded anything a grieving person actually wanted to hear. She mentioned a financial advisor she knew. She mentioned the senior center on Broad Street. She mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence, that a lot of people found it helpful to talk to someone professional. I thanked her each time. I meant it. Carol Simmons is a genuinely kind woman whose only real flaw is believing that problems can be solved with enough pound cake and enough practical suggestions. She is not wrong about the pound cake. Mitchell called on day 19. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second coffee, looking at nothing in particular, when my phone rang. I saw his name on the screen and picked up immediately. The way you do when you have been waiting for your child to call even though you would never say that out loud. "Dad," he said. "How are you holding up?" I told him I was fine, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of not entirely true that both of us were comfortable with. There was a pause. Mitchell pauses the way lawyers pause, which is to say it is never actually empty. There is always something being calculated inside it. Then he said, I have been thinking about some practical matters. With the estate and everything. I put my coffee down. He said the house was substantial. He said the maintenance costs on a property that size were not insignificant for a single person. He said he had a contact at a wealth management firm in Charlotte who specialized in estate transitions. He used the phrase estate transition twice in 4 sentences, which is 2 times more than any conversation with a son about his father's home should ever contain. I said, Mitchell, are you suggesting I sell this house? He paused again. I am suggesting we explore all the options, he said, to make sure you are taken care of. There it was. That phrase. Taken care of. In my experience, when your adult child tells you they want to make sure you are taken care of, what they actually mean is that they would like to make decisions involving your assets while you are still present to observe them making those decisions. I have cooked for enough powerful people in enough expensive restaurants to recognize when someone is offering you something that mostly benefits them. I told him I would think about it. He said, good. I said I would really think about it. He said he was glad. Neither of us believed the other, and both of us were too polite to say so. That is its own kind of love, I suppose. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The pound cake was on the counter. The casseroles were still in the refrigerator. The cast iron skillet hung above the stove exactly where it always had, and the knife block sat exactly where it always had, and Grace's small ceramic bowl by the sink still had her hair ties in it because I had not been able to move them. I thought about what Mitchell had said. I thought about the phrase, estate transition. I thought about Grace, who had handled every practical matter of our shared life with the calm efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed solving problems. The taxes, the insurance, the investment accounts, Grace had managed all of it, not because I was incapable, but because she was faster, and she liked it, and I was usually in a kitchen somewhere not paying attention. What had she left exactly? What did I actually know about our finances, beyond the broad strokes she had sketched for me over the years? The answer, when I examined it honestly, was not as much as I should have. I got up from the table. I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where Grace kept the household files, neatly labeled in her looping handwriting, alphabetical and color-coded, in a way that made me feel simultaneously grateful and embarrassed. I opened her laptop, which I had not touched since before she died. The password was my name. Of course it was. I sat down and opened her email. I was not sure what I was looking for. I told myself I was just getting organized. That was what I told myself. I had been scrolling for about 20 minutes when I found the first email from a place called the Millstone Inn. I have received exactly 2 emails in my life that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own story. The first was from Grace, 31 years ago. 3 days after we met at a dinner party in Columbia, where I had been catering, and she had been a guest. And she had walked into the kitchen afterward to tell me, very directly, that the sauce on the lamb had been slightly oversalted, and she would very much like to have dinner with me sometime to discuss it. That email, sent from a university address with her full name in the signature, had arrived on a Tuesday morning and changed the entire direction of my life. The second email arrived on a Tuesday morning as well. I do not know if that means anything. I have decided to believe that it does. The subject line read, regarding your reservation, the Millstone Inn, Woodstock, Vermont. It had been sent 3 weeks before Grace died to her personal email address, and it was a confirmation. A table for one, the email said. Reserved under the name G. Ellison, for a date that was still 6 weeks away. At the bottom of the email, in the signature block of whoever had written it, was a handwritten note that had been scanned and attached as an image. The note said, everything is ready. We will see him when he gets here. Take care of yourself, Grace. E. I read that note 4 times. Then I read it a 5th time. Then I sat back in Grace's desk chair and looked at the ceiling of our living room and said, out loud to nobody, what in the world were you doing? The ceiling did not answer. It never does. But there was a phone number at the bottom of the email signature, beneath the name of the restaurant, and a small hand-drawn image of a millstone. And after approximately 10 minutes of sitting very still, I picked up my phone and dialed it. It rang 3 times. Then a woman answered. "The Millstone Inn," she said. Her voice was unhurried. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who is used to being exactly where they are and has no particular need to be anywhere else. I said, "My name is Tom Ellison. I am calling about a reservation." I paused. My wife made it. There was a brief silence on the other end. Not an uncomfortable one. More like the silence of someone who had been expecting a call and was now taking a moment to recognize that it had arrived. Then the woman said, "Mr. Ellison, I am very glad you called. My name is Eleanor Quinn. I have been hoping to hear from you," I said. "You were expecting me to call?" She said, "Your wife told me you would. She said it might take you a few weeks to get around to it, but that you would get there eventually. She said you were not the kind of man who left things unresolved, even when you were not entirely sure what the thing was." I did not say anything for a moment. "That was," I said finally, "an extremely accurate description." Eleanor Quinn did not laugh exactly, but there was something warm in the pause that followed that felt adjacent to a laugh. She said, "Mr. Ellison, there are some things I should tell you that are probably better said in person, but I want you to know before you decide anything that your wife was very deliberate about all of this. Everything she did carefully. She thought about you in every single decision she made." I said, "Can you tell me what she did?" "Exactly." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She bought the restaurant, Mr. Ellison, about 14 months ago. She paid cash, in full, in her own name. The Millstone Inn belongs to you now." I sat down. I had been standing without realizing it, and my legs made the decision to sit before my brain had finished processing what had just been said to me. I lowered myself onto the edge of the desk chair and put one hand flat on Grace's desk, on top of a stack of her neatly labeled files. And I breathed. "She bought a restaurant," I said. "She did," Eleanor said. "And she left very specific instructions about what was supposed to happen next," I said. "Did she leave instructions about everything?" I could hear the smile in Eleanor's voice when she answered. "She left instructions about most things," she said. "She mentioned that you might push back on some of them. She said to tell you that she had accounted for that too." I closed my eyes. 31 years of marriage. 31 years. And Grace Ellison could still do this. Could still reach across whatever distance existed between us now and rearrange my entire understanding of my own life with the calm precision of a woman who had simply thought further ahead than anyone else in the room. In this case, the room was approximately 1,000 miles wide, and she had still managed to be the smartest person in it. I opened my eyes. I said, "Miss Quinn, I think I need to come up there." She said, "I think that would be a very good idea, Mr. Ellison. The reservation is still open. It has been open for 6 weeks, and it will stay open as long as you need." I said, "I will drive up on Wednesday." She said, "I will make sure the kitchen is stocked. Grace told me how you take your coffee." I held the phone for a moment after we hung up. Then I set it down on the desk next to Grace's files and looked at the room around me. The living room of our house on Trad Street, with its familiar furniture and its familiar light, and the small framed photograph of Grace and me on our wedding day that she had insisted on hanging slightly too high on the wall so that you had to look up at it. I looked up at it now. 31 years, I said quietly. "And you are still surprising me." I did not call Mitchell. I thought about it. I picked up my phone twice and put it back down twice. What would I have said? "Your mother bought a restaurant in Vermont and left me a reservation and a woman named Eleanor Quinn who already knows how I take my coffee?" Mitchell would have had his financial advisor on the phone within the hour. I went upstairs and pulled a bag from the closet. I packed enough for a week, because I had learned from 31 years of living with Grace Ellison that when she made arrangements, she made thorough arrangements, and a week seemed like the minimum amount of time thorough arrangements might require. Then I went downstairs, wrote a note for Carol that said "Gone North, back when I am back," and left it under her door on my way to the garage. I pulled out of Charleston at 6:15 on Wednesday morning with a full tank of gas and a travel mug of coffee and absolutely no idea what I was driving toward. That is not entirely true. I had some idea. I just could not put it into words yet. There is a particular kind of thinking that only happens when you are alone in a car on a long drive. Not the organized, productive kind of thinking you do at a desk. The other kind. The kind that moves sideways and backward and occasionally stops completely to look at something you have been driving past for years without actually seeing. I crossed into North Carolina just after 8 in the morning. The sky was the particular shade of pale blue that Grace used to call dishwater blue, which was not a compliment toward the sky, but was somehow still accurate. She had opinions about skies the way she had opinions about everything, which is to say completely and without apology, and usually correct. I had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times over the years. Catering jobs in Charlotte, weekends visiting Grace's sister in Greensboro before her sister moved to Phoenix, and the visits stopped. I knew this road, but I had never driven it alone in quite this way, with nothing in the passenger seat, and nowhere specific to be, and the particular weight of a dead woman's secret sitting in the back of my chest, like a stone I had not yet figured out how to put down. Grace had bought a restaurant in Vermont with cash. I said it out loud to the windshield, just to hear it again. It did not sound any less extraordinary the second time. I thought about the first long drive we ever took together. We had been married 4 months, living in a small apartment in Columbia, and I had been offered a stage at a restaurant in Washington, a trial period to prove I was worth hiring. Grace had insisted on driving up with me. I told her it was a 14-hour round trip for a 2-hour meeting. She said she was aware of that, and had already packed sandwiches. That was Grace. The logistics were never an obstacle. They were just the part you handled before the interesting part started. She had driven the first 4 hours while I reviewed my notes. Somewhere in Southern Virginia, she said, "Tom, put the notes away. You already know everything in them. Look at the trees." I looked at the trees. They were unremarkable Virginia pines along the highway median. But she was right that looking at them was better than reading the same notes for the 4th time. That had been 30 years ago. Give or take. I stopped for gas north of Greensboro. The station had a small convenience store, and I bought a coffee that was aggressively mediocre and a packaged sandwich I knew I would regret. I ate half of it standing beside my truck in the July heat, while a family with 3 small children piled out of a minivan next to me. The father was managing the gas pump, and a toddler simultaneously. The mother was consulting her phone. The oldest child, a girl of maybe 8 or 9, stood very still beside the car, looking at the distant mountains with complete absorption. Grace would have noticed that child immediately. She had a talent for finding the still point in any room, the person quietly paying attention while everyone else managed the situation. She used to say the still people were always the most interesting. I used to say she would know. She always looked at me when I said that as if she could not decide whether I was being romantic or insufferable. In 31 years, I never entirely resolved that for her. I finished the sandwich and got back on the road. Virginia went past in long green stretches. Somewhere in Maryland, around 2 in the afternoon, I found myself thinking about the last real trip Grace and I had taken together, 3 years before she died, when she was still well enough to travel, if we planned carefully. We had driven to the Outer Banks for 4 days. Her idea. She had found a small inn right on the water with a restaurant attached that she thought I might like. She was always doing that, finding places with restaurants attached, as if she understood that I needed to be near a kitchen, the way other people needed to be near water. We sat on the porch of that inn on our last evening there, watching the sun go down over the sound. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, Tom, when I am gone, I need you to promise me something. I told her not to talk like that. She said, I am not talking like anything. I am talking like a practical person who loves you and has things to say. Now be quiet and listen. I was quiet and listened. She said, promise me you will not stop. Not the cooking, not the living, not the being interested in things. Promise me you will find your way back to all of it. I promised. The way you promise things to the person you love when they ask directly, and the sun is going down, and the sound is pink and gold in the evening light, and refusing feels like the worst thing you could possibly do. I had kept that promise imperfectly. Which is to say, I had not kept it at all. I crossed into Connecticut as the afternoon light began shifting toward gold. The temperature dropped enough that I turned off the air conditioning and opened the window. The air smelled like grass and something faintly coastal, the way New England begins to smell before you are actually in New England. I stopped for dinner at a small diner just off the interstate outside of New Haven. The real kind, with a counter and stools and a menu laminated enough times it had begun to feel structural. I ordered eggs and toast and coffee and sat at the counter and did not talk to anyone, and no one talked to me, which was exactly what I needed. The eggs were fine. The toast was good. The coffee was better than the gas station and worse than what I made at home, which put it squarely in the category of adequate. Adequate is sometimes the most honest thing a cup of coffee can be. I left a 20 on the counter and walked back to my truck. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere above the diner's flat roof, the first stars were beginning to appear in a sky that had gone from blue to purple to the deep gray of a summer night that has not yet decided to be fully dark. Vermont was still 2 hours north. I thought about Grace's hands. The way they had looked in the last months, the effort it took her to write, the way she had still insisted on writing by hand because she said it was more honest than typing, and she did not have time left for dishonesty. She had written something. 8 pages, Eleanor had said. 8 pages in those hands, waiting for me somewhere in a kitchen in Vermont. I got back in the truck and kept driving. The Connecticut interstate at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night is a particular kind of lonely. Not the bad kind. The honest kind. The kind where the highway opens up and the other cars thin out and the darkness between the exits gets wider and you start to feel the specific weight of distance, how much road there is between where you were and where you are going, and how that distance is also something else entirely, if you let yourself think about it that way. I let myself think about it that way for approximately 45 minutes. Then I crossed into Massachusetts and turned my attention to the road. Route 91 North cuts up through the Connecticut River Valley and into Vermont in a way that feels gradual and then suddenly complete. The way certain changes in your life feel gradual and then suddenly complete. One moment you are in the familiar geography of southern New England, gas stations and chain restaurants and the orange glow of suburb light against the low clouds. Then the exits get farther apart. Then the trees get taller and closer to the road. Then somewhere around Brattleboro the darkness gets a different quality entirely, deeper and more serious. The kind of dark that belongs to places that have not been convinced yet that constant illumination is an improvement. I crossed into Vermont just after 10:30 at night. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since Connecticut. I had the window down an inch, and the air coming through it was cool and smelled like pine, and something I could not name but recognized as the smell of places that have had more time than people to figure out what they are. Vermont in July at night smells like a place that has been there a long time and intends to stay. I had the address of the Millstone Inn in my phone. Eleanor had texted it after our call, along with a message that said, "Take your time getting here. The place is not going anywhere. Neither am I." It was exactly the right thing to say, which made me think Grace had chosen well when she chose Eleanor Quinn. The town of Woodstock appeared on my GPS about 20 minutes after I crossed the state line. I had looked it up briefly on my phone the previous evening before going to bed. Historic district. Village green. White church steeples. The kind of New England town that people from other parts of the country drive to specifically to look at, because it looks the way they imagine New England would look before they had ever been there. At 11 o'clock at night, It looked like a painting of itself, with the lights turned down. I drove slowly down the main street. The storefronts were dark. The village green was empty. A single street lamp threw a circle of yellow light onto the sidewalk in front of what appeared to be a hardware store. And the effect was so quiet and so complete that I found myself slowing down further, not wanting to disturb it. The Millstone Inn was on a side street 2 blocks off the main drag, according to my GPS. I turned left at the white church and followed the road another 100 yards, and then my headlights caught the sign. It was hand-painted on a piece of weathered wood, hung above a dark green door. The letters were done in a deep burgundy, slightly uneven, the kind of sign that someone had made themselves rather than ordered. The small image of a millstone beside the name was carefully rendered, more careful than the letters, as if whoever painted it had spent more time on the image than the words. Grace would have loved it immediately. She would have stood in front of it for a full minute, taking it in, and then she would have said something specific about the font that I would not have fully understood, but would have listened to anyway. The restaurant was dark inside, or nearly dark. There was a light on somewhere in the back, past the dining room, in what I assumed was the kitchen, not the bright, functional light of a kitchen in full service. A quieter light, the kind that a single lamp makes when someone has left it on for a specific reason. I turned off my engine and sat in the parking lot. The parking lot was small, 4 or 5 spaces, gravel rather than asphalt, bordered on one side by a low stone wall, and on the other by the beginning of a stand of birch trees whose white bark caught my headlights for a moment before I cut them. In the sudden darkness, the light from the kitchen window became more visible, and with it, the shadow of someone moving inside. Someone was in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. I watched the shadow for a moment. It moved with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly where everything was, reaching, placing, turning. The movements of a person who was comfortable in that space, the way you are only comfortable in a place you have spent real time in. I thought about getting out of the car. I sat with that thought for a while. The parking lot gravel was pale in the moonlight. The birch trees were very still. The kitchen light held steady in the window of the Millstone Inn. Then I thought about what Grace had written to Eleanor. Take care of yourself. What Eleanor had said to me on the phone. Take your time getting here. I started the car again. There was a motel a half-mile back on the main road. I had seen it when I came through. A small white building with a vacancy sign still lit in the window. I drove back to it and went inside and paid for a room with a queen bed and a view of the parking lot, which is the kind of view you get when you arrive somewhere at 11:15 at night without a reservation. The room was clean. The bed was adequate, which I was beginning to find was my word of the day. I set my bag on the chair by the window and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a moment. I thought about the light in the kitchen window, about the shadow moving inside it with that quiet, certain efficiency, about the fact that Grace had put that light there, in a manner of speaking, had arranged for it to be on when I arrived. Even if she could not have known exactly when I would arrive, she had arranged for someone to be there. I lay back on the bed without taking off my shoes, which is something I have not done since I was about 22 years old and considerably less careful about things. The ceiling of the motel room was plain white with a small water stain in one corner shaped like nothing in particular. Tomorrow morning, I thought. I will go in the morning. I closed my eyes. Outside, Vermont was very quiet. And somewhere 2 blocks from the village green, in a kitchen that belonged to me in ways I did not yet fully understand, a light was still on. I woke up at 5:40 without an alarm, which is what happens when you have spent 30 years in professional kitchens. Your body stops believing in sleeping past 6. It does not matter where you are or what the circumstances are. 5:40. And you are awake. And that is simply the terms. I showered, put on the same clothes I had driven in, and accepted a cup of machine coffee from the motel office. I drank it standing by the window, looking at the birch trees beyond the parking lot and the particular quality of early morning light in Vermont in July, which is softer than the light in South Carolina in a way that feels almost apologetic. I drove to the Millstone Inn at 6:15. In the daylight, Woodstock looked exactly like what it was. A small New England town that had been carefully preserved and knew it. The village green was anchored on one end by the white church, and on the other by a covered bridge over a shallow river. The morning light came in low over the surrounding hills and made the whole thing look, as I had suspected it might, like a painting of itself. I turned onto the side street and pulled into the gravel parking lot. In the daylight, the restaurant looked smaller than it had the night before, and more specific. The dark green door was the exact shade Grace had always called proper green, as opposed to the various improper greens she had identified over the years in other contexts. The stone wall along the left side of the parking lot was old enough to have moss on it. The birch trees behind the wall were tall and still in the early morning air. And then there was the sign, hand-painted on weathered wood, the letters done carefully but not perfectly. The M in Millstone was slightly larger than the others. The I in inn leaned very slightly to the right. Whoever had painted it had done so with genuine care and without a ruler, which meant the result was the kind of sign you looked at and felt something about, rather than simply registering the information it contained. Grace would have loved it immediately, and spent 20 minutes telling me exactly why the font was not quite right. I stood in the parking lot looking at it and felt, for the first time since leaving Charleston, something that was not grief and not confusion. I could not name it precisely. It was small and quiet, and it was there. I walked to the dark green door and knocked. Footsteps came from inside, unhurried. The door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, in a way that looked less like aging and more like a decision she had made and was comfortable with. She wore a canvas apron over a blue linen shirt, and the apron had flour on it in 2 places, which meant she had already been working this morning. She had been in that kitchen since before 6:15. That told me something about her before she said a single word. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You must be Tom." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Grace described you. She said you would show up early, you would be wearing whatever you had driven in, and you would look like a man who has been thinking for 18 hours straight and has not quite finished." I said, "That is accurate on all 3 counts." She stepped back from the door. "Eleanor Quinn," she said, "come in. I just made coffee, and there is enough for 2. The inside of the Millstone Inn was a single room, not large, with 12 tables set with plain white linens and simple wooden chairs. The walls were exposed brick, hung with framed photographs of Vermont in different seasons. The floor was wide plank, worn smooth in the paths between tables. The way floors get worn in places that have been used honestly for a long time. At the far end of the room, past the last row of tables, was the kitchen. Open. No pass-through wall. 8 burners, commercial grade, well-maintained. Copper pots hanging above the station caught the morning light, in a way that was, I will admit, slightly arresting. Eleanor poured 2 cups from a French press and sat across from me at a table near the window, with the ease of someone who had sat there many times before. The coffee was very good. Not adequate. Not fine. Very good. The kind that tells you something about the person who made it. I said, "Grace told you how I take it." Eleanor said, "Black, no sugar, hot enough that most people would wait. But you never do." I looked at her across the table. She met my eyes without self-consciousness, the way people do when they have nothing to hide, and no need to manage your impression of them. It was, I realized, the same quality Grace had always had, the stillness of someone who is completely where they are. I said, "How did you meet her?" Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup and smiled. "The real kind," she said. "She came in alone on a Friday evening in October, about 14 months ago, sat at the corner table, ordered the roast chicken, and ate the whole thing without looking at her phone once. When she finished, she came to the counter and told me the chicken was very good, but the pan sauce needed more time. Then she asked if the restaurant was for sale. I said, She asked that same night? Eleanor said before she paid the check. I looked down at my coffee. That is the most Grace sentence I have ever heard, I said. Eleanor said, that is exactly what I thought. I liked her immediately. She stood up then, picked up her cup and said, come on. There is something I want to show you. She led me past the tables, through the wide opening, and into the kitchen. I stepped over the threshold and stopped. The kitchen smelled like coffee and butter, and beneath that, the clean smell of a space that is well cared for. The stove was warm. Someone had been cooking before I arrived, and the evidence of it was still in the air. Eleanor walked to the prep counter along the back wall and opened the second drawer from the left. Inside was a single envelope. My name was on the front of it, written in Grace's handwriting, that looping, forward-leaning cursive she had kept since college, the one I would know in any context, in any light, under any circumstances, for as long as I lived. Eleanor stepped back without saying anything. I stood in that kitchen on a Thursday morning in July and looked at my name in my dead wife's handwriting and did not move for a long moment. Then I reached out and picked it up. I have cooked in Michelin-starred kitchens. I have kept my hands steady through fire and chaos and a dinner service for 400 people on New Year's Eve when the sous chef walked out at 7 o'clock and the expediter burned his hand on the salamander and we were still somehow plating the last dessert at 11:45, with everything intact. My hands have been, over the course of my professional life, one of the most reliable things about me. My hands were not steady when I held that envelope. Eleanor said, take your time. I will be out front if you need anything. She said it the way someone says something when they understand exactly what is required and have no interest in making it more complicated than it needs to be. Then she walked back through the kitchen door, and I heard the quiet sound of a chair being pulled out at one of the dining room tables, and then nothing. I stood alone in the kitchen of the Millstone Inn and looked at my name in Grace's handwriting for a long moment. Then I opened the envelope. There were 8 pages inside, folded in thirds, written on both sides in Grace's looping cursive. The handwriting was steady throughout. That was the first thing I noticed, and the first thing that undid me a little. She had written this knowing exactly what she was doing, knowing exactly where I would be standing, knowing exactly how my face would look when I opened it, and her hand had been steady the entire time. The first page began the way Grace began most important conversations, which is to say directly and without unnecessary preamble. She wrote, Tom, I have some things to explain, and I need you to read all of them before you decide how you feel about any of it. I know you. You will want to stop at the part that surprises you, and sit with it for a while before continuing. Do not do that. Read the whole thing first, then sit with it. I almost smiled. That was, in fact, exactly what I had been about to do. She wrote about the restaurant first. 14 months ago, she had driven up to Vermont alone on what she told me was a weekend trip to visit an old colleague from the university where she had worked before she retired. There was no colleague. There had been a listing on a real estate website for a small restaurant in Woodstock, Vermont, and Grace had seen it at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday when she could not sleep, and she had driven up 3 days later to look at it in person because that was how Grace made decisions about things she had already decided. She wrote, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking I should have told you. And you are right, in the ordinary sense of things. But Tom, you would have talked me out of it. Not because you would have thought it was wrong, but because you would have thought it was too much. You have spent 31 years thinking things were too much for me. And I have spent 31 years proving you wrong. And I did not have the energy for that particular conversation anymore. So I made the decision, and I am telling you about it now, which is functionally the same thing, just in a different order. I read that paragraph twice. She wrote about the drive up, how she had taken Interstate 81 north through Virginia and into Pennsylvania, and then across into New England, stopping for the night in Springfield, Massachusetts, because she did not want to arrive tired. How she had found Woodstock the following morning and driven slowly down the main street and thought, Tom would like this place. He would pretend he did not, because it is too picturesque, and he distrusts things that are too picturesque, but he would like it. She was correct on both counts. She wrote about the Millstone Inn, how she had gone in for dinner alone on a Friday evening and eaten the roast chicken, and found the pan sauce wanting and introduced herself to the owner afterward, how she had recognized, in Eleanor Quinn, something she trusted immediately, without being entirely able to articulate why. She wrote, "There are people you meet, and you know within 20 minutes that they are the real thing. Eleanor is the real thing. I knew it before we had finished our first cup of coffee." She wrote about the restaurant itself, the reasons she had bought it. Not primarily as an investment, though she had done the numbers, and they were reasonable. Not primarily as a project, though she knew I would need one. She wrote, "Tom, you stopped cooking for the world when I got sick. I understand why. I am not criticizing it. But a man who does not cook is not entirely himself. And I needed to know that when I was gone, there was somewhere specific for you to go back to. Not just the idea of cooking, a specific kitchen, a specific stove, a specific reason to get up in the morning and put on your apron and do the thing you were made to do." I put the pages down on the prep counter for a moment and looked at the stove. 8 burners. The copper pots catching the morning light. The knife block with its 8 knives in descending order. She had chosen this kitchen for me, had stood in this exact room, and looked at this exact stove, and thought, yes, this is the one. This is where he needs to be. I picked the pages back up. On page 3, she wrote about the financial arrangements, which were thorough and specific, in the way all of Grace's arrangements were thorough and specific. The account she had kept separately for the past 3 years. The lawyer in Burlington she had retained to handle the transfer. The documentation she had prepared in the event of any complications, which she described, without further elaboration, as comprehensive. I noted the word comprehensive and made a mental note to ask Eleanor about it later. On page 4, she wrote about the first year. What she imagined it would look like, practically speaking. The inn had a small but loyal local clientele. Eleanor knew the suppliers, the rhythms of the tourist season, the particular preferences of the regulars. She had agreed to stay on through the transition for as long as I needed her, which Grace estimated, with characteristic precision, would be approximately 6 months before I was ready to do things my own way. She wrote, "You will disagree with her about the menu within the first week. That is fine. She can handle it. She has been handling difficult chefs her entire career, and you are, on your worst day, considerably less difficult than most." I was not sure whether that was a compliment. I turned to page 5. The first sentence of page 5 was, "Her name is Eleanor Quinn, and I need to tell you how she came to be here, and why I asked her to stay." I had known, since Eleanor opened the door that morning, that Grace had put her there deliberately. I had known it the way you know certain things without being told. The way 31 years of marriage teaches you to read the architecture of the decisions the person you love makes on your behalf. But seeing it written down, in that handwriting, on that page, was something different. I stood in the kitchen of the Millstone Inn and kept reading. Page 5 began with a sentence I read 3 times before moving on. Grace wrote, "I am not trying to arrange your future, Tom. I am trying to make sure you have one." I stood very still for a moment. Then I kept reading. She wrote about Eleanor the way she wrote about things she had thought carefully about, which is to say with specificity and without sentimentality. She had met Eleanor on that first Friday evening in October, over the roast chicken and the pan sauce conversation, and they had talked for 2 hours after the last table left. She wrote, "I told her about my diagnosis. I told her about you. I told her about the cooking and the knives you put away, and the kitchen on Trad Street that you walk through every morning without turning on the stove." She listened to all of it, without once looking at the clock. Grace wrote that Eleanor had lost her husband David 5 years earlier. A sudden thing. A heart attack on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The kind of loss that does not give you time to prepare, she wrote. Eleanor knows what it is to be restructured by grief and have to figure out, quietly and without fanfare, how to be that new person without losing the one you were before. I thought you might recognize each other. She was careful not to say what she expected to come from that recognition. Grace was always careful about the things she was most deliberate about. She wrote about the 4 weekends they had spent together in Vermont over the past 14 months. How they had sat at the table by the window and talked about the restaurant, the menu, the regulars. How on their last weekend together, 3 months before Grace died, Eleanor had made soup from scratch because Grace mentioned she was cold. Just mentioned it in passing. And Eleanor had disappeared into the kitchen and returned 40 minutes later with something Grace described as the best thing she had eaten in 2 years. Grace wrote, "She is the kind of person who listens to what you actually say instead of what they expected you to say. Those people are not common. When you find one, you hold on." I was not entirely sure what she meant by hold on. I suspected she knew I would not be sure and had chosen the phrase for exactly that reason. On page 6, she wrote about the 12 years. She was direct in the way she was direct about things that mattered. She wrote, "Tom, when I got sick, you put your knives away. You came home from the restaurant and did not go back, and temporary became a year. And a year became 12, and somewhere in those 12 years, the thing that was most essentially, you became something you visited in memory, rather than something you lived in every day. I watched that happen and said too little about it because I was too grateful for your presence to risk pushing you away. That was my mistake. I am correcting it now." She wrote, "You were a great chef, Tom. The world you cooked in was better for having you in it. The 12 years were not a waste. But they are enough. It is time to come back." I set the pages down and put both hands flat on the prep counter and looked at the stove. 8 burners. Well maintained. The copper pots. The knife block, with its 8 knives in descending order. I had not cooked a professional meal in 12 years. I had made eggs. I had made soup from cans, which Grace would have found distressing. I had stood in the kitchen on Trad Street every morning and made coffee and looked at the cold stove and not turned it on. I picked the pages back up. On page 7, she wrote about what she hoped the restaurant might become. Not a grand vision. Something smaller and more honest. A good kitchen doing honest food for people who appreciated it. The kind of place, she wrote, where someone could come in alone on a Friday evening and eat a roast chicken and feel, for the duration of that meal, that the world was being taken care of, in at least this one particular way. I recognized the description immediately. It was exactly what she had found when she walked into the Millstone Inn 14 months ago. She had bought herself a memory and given it to me. That was such a Grace thing to do that I had to put the pages down again and look at the ceiling for a moment. The ceiling of the Millstone Inn kitchen was exposed beam. Old wood, the kind that has been there long enough to have a color you cannot quite name. I looked at it for a while. Then I picked up page 8. The last page was shorter than the others. She wrote, "There is a safe under the bar in the dining room. The combination is Mitchell's birthday, month and day, and year, in that order. Inside are 2 things. The first is a document prepared by Gerald Harmon, my attorney in Burlington. The second is for Mitchell. Do not open it. It is not for you. And I mean that in the kindest possible way." Then she wrote, "I love you, Tom. I have loved you since the dinner party in Columbia, where you oversalted the lamb sauce, and I decided to marry you anyway. I have loved you through 31 years and a leaky dishwasher and 3 apartments and 1 house and 5 years of Parkinson's disease and 12 years of cold stoves. I am sorry I cannot be there for whatever comes next. But I did the best I could from here." The last line read, "Now go turn on the stove." I folded the 8 pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. I placed the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest. Then I stood in that kitchen for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just listening to the particular silence a well-built kitchen has when no one is cooking in it. After a while, I heard Eleanor's chair move in the dining room. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with the patient eyes of a woman who has seen considerable amounts of human weather and is not frightened by any of it. She said quietly, "Are you all right?" I said. She mentioned a safe under the bar. Eleanor nodded. "She did," I said. She also said to turn on the stove. Eleanor looked at the stove, then back at me. She said, "It is a very good stove." I said, "I know." I walked to the stove and turned on the nearest burner. The blue flame came up clean and steady and immediate, the way a good stove always does when it has been properly maintained. I stood there and looked at it for a moment. Then I turned it off. Not yet, but soon. Eleanor did not ask me what was in the letter. She came back into the kitchen, looked at me standing by the stove with my hand still resting on the burner knob, and made a decision about what was needed that had nothing to do with questions. She went to the refrigerator, took out a carton of eggs and a block of butter, and set a pan on the burner next to the one I had just turned off. I watched her crack 4 eggs into a bowl with the efficient one-handed motion of someone who has done it 10,000 times. She whisked them with a fork, not a whisk, which is the correct choice if you know what you are doing, and added butter to the pan before it was fully hot, which is also correct and something a surprising number of people get wrong. I said, "You cook?" She said, "I have been cooking since I was 7 years old. I am not a chef, but I know what I am doing." I said, "Those are not always the same thing." She looked up at me briefly. "No," she said. "They are not." She cooked the eggs low and slow, moving them constantly with a wooden spoon, pulling the pan off the heat twice before they were finished. When she slid them onto the plates, they were soft and just set, the exact texture that takes patience and a willingness to stop before you think you should. She added a small amount of salt and nothing else. They were the best scrambled eggs I had eaten in 12 years. I almost told her immediately. I did not. Some compliments take time to earn the right to say. We sat at the table by the window and ate without speaking for a while. The morning light had shifted since I arrived, coming through the window at an angle that caught the steam from our plates and made it briefly visible. Outside, Woodstock was beginning its day. I could hear faintly the sound of a delivery truck on the main street. After a while, Eleanor said, "Grace told me about the restaurant where you worked in Charleston. The one you left when she got sick." I said, "Harlow's. I was executive chef there for 9 years. Eleanor said, "She told me you were extraordinary there." She used that word specifically. She said she went in for dinner once without telling you, just to watch you work. And she sat at the bar for 2 hours and cried twice, which she said was embarrassing but unavoidable. I set my fork down. Grace had never told me that. I said, "She never mentioned it." Eleanor said, "She was afraid you would become self-conscious. She said you cooked better when you forgot she was watching." I looked out the window at the covered bridge visible at the end of the street. The river beneath it was moving in the morning light in the way that moving water catches light, which is the most honest kind of beautiful, because it is never the same twice and never tries to be. After a moment I said, "Tell me about David." Eleanor was quiet for a beat. The way people are quiet when they are deciding not which words to use, but whether the words are ready at all. Then, she said, "He was a carpenter. He built custom furniture for people who wanted things made properly and were willing to wait. He died on a Wednesday morning 5 years ago while I was at the farmer's market. He was 58 years old and had no history of heart trouble, and it was completely without warning." She said it plainly, without the careful packaging that grief sometimes develops when you have told the story enough that it begins to feel like a story rather than a fact. It still sounded like a fact. I said, "I am sorry." She said, "Thank you. He was a good man and a fine carpenter, and he made me laugh every single day for 23 years, which I have decided is the most important thing you can say about a person." I thought about Grace. About 31 years of being made to laugh. Not every day, because that would be too easy. and Grace was not interested in easy, but reliably. In the particular way of someone who found the world genuinely funny and wanted to share that with the person sitting next to her. I said. Grace made me laugh too. Eleanor smiled. I know, she said. She told me. She said you laughed at things other people did not find funny and missed things other people found obvious, and that she had spent 31 years finding both qualities equally endearing and occasionally maddening. I said, that is accurate. Eleanor said, she talked about you every time she came up here. Every single visit. I know about the restaurant in Columbia where you met. I know about the apartment with the broken radiator you fixed incorrectly 3 times before admitting defeat. I know you have strong opinions about cast iron cookware and that you cried at the end of a certain animated film about toys and told Grace it was seasonal allergies. I said. It was a very aggressive allergy season. Eleanor looked at me with the patient, unconvinced expression of a woman who has heard that particular defense before and moved on diplomatically. I appreciated that considerably. She refilled my coffee from the French press without asking, timing it exactly right when the cup was down to the last inch, the way you refill someone's coffee when you have been paying attention rather than waiting to be asked. Grace had taught her that, or Grace had recognized it in her, and that was why she had chosen her. I was not sure which, and I was not sure it mattered. I said, she planned all of this, didn't she? It was not entirely a question, Eleanor said. About 18 months ago, she sat at this table and said, Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. And I said, Grace, that sentence has never once preceded good news. She paused. Her voice went just slightly careful. She said, I am not going to be here as long as I would like, but Tom is going to need somewhere to land, and I cannot leave him without one. So I need you to be here when he finds this place. Not immediately. Let him breathe. But be here. The table was very quiet. I said, and you agreed. Eleanor said, I told her I was honored. And I meant it. I looked out at the covered bridge and the river and the morning light, doing what morning light does when it has good material to work with. I was about to say something when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Mitchell. I looked at his name for a long moment. Then I set the phone face down on the table and picked up my coffee cup. Eleanor watched me do this without comment, which was, I realized, exactly the right response. Mitchell called 7 times in 3 days. I know because I counted. On the first day he called twice. Once in the morning and once in the evening, which suggested he was still operating under the assumption that I had a schedule. On the second day he called 3 times. The last one at 10:15 at night, which suggested the assumption about the schedule had been revised. On the third day he called twice more, and the second call went on for 4 rings longer than the others before going to voicemail, which I interpreted as emphasis. I did not pick up. This was not something I had done before in 39 years of Mitchell being my son. I had always picked up. It had not previously occurred to me that not picking up was an option available to me, which tells you something about the habits that accumulate over the course of a life without your noticing them. In between the calls I walked. Woodstock in July is the kind of town that rewards walking slowly and without particular purpose, which suited my current situation precisely. I walked the length of the main street in the mornings, past the hardware store and the bookshop and the small pharmacy with the handwritten specials in the window. I walked the trail along the Ottauquechee River in the afternoons, where the water moved over smooth stones, with the unhurried confidence of something that has been doing this for a very long time and sees no reason to change its approach. I ate breakfast at the Millstone Inn each morning. Eleanor made coffee, and we sat at the table by the window and talked, or did not talk, with equal comfort. She was teaching herself, she told me, to make pasta by hand. And she was at the stage of the process where the results were instructive rather than edible. I told her what she was doing wrong. She told me I was not as subtle about it as I thought I was. We disagreed, pleasantly, about the hydration ratio. And I found myself, on the third morning, genuinely looking forward to the conversation before I got there, which was something I noted and did not examine too closely. On the fourth day, when Mitchell called at 8:40 in the morning, I picked up, not because I was ready, because 7 missed calls from your only son exists in a category between crisis and confrontation, and I needed to know which one I was dealing with. He said, "Dad." His voice had the particular quality of someone who has been rehearsing an opening and has decided at the last moment to abandon it in favor of something simpler. I said, "Mitchell." He said, "You left Charleston without telling anyone." I said, "I told Carol." He said, "You left a note under her door that said gone north." I said, "That is accurate and informative." There was a pause, the particular kind of pause that precedes a pivot. Then he said, "I have been in contact with Gerald Harmon, Mom's attorney in Burlington." I set down the coffee cup I had been holding. I said, "Have you?" He said, "Dad, there are some concerns about the structure of this arrangement. A restaurant is a significant asset. The way it was acquired and transferred raises questions about whether it was properly disclosed as a marital asset and whether the estate was handled in a manner consistent with." I said, "Mitchell." He stopped. I said, "Are you telling me you are considering a legal challenge to your mother's estate?" Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "I am telling you, I have spoken to an attorney about our options. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know, and because I think you are making decisions based on grief rather than sound judgment. And because this restaurant idea is, Dad, it is not realistic. You have not cooked professionally in 12 years. You are 64 years old." I said. Your mother disagreed. Silence. He said, "Dad," I said. "She left very specific instructions, Mitchell. She thought about this for 14 months. She retained a lawyer. She prepared documentation. She did not do any of that carelessly." He said, "I understand that. But Mom was sick. And sometimes, when people are sick, they make decisions that seem," I said. "Finish that sentence carefully." He did not finish it. Which was, I thought, the correct decision. After a moment he said, "I just want to make sure you are protected. That is all I have ever wanted." I said, "I know that, son. I do. But there is a difference between protecting someone and managing them. And I need you to think about which one you are doing right now." The line was quiet for a long time. I could hear, faintly, the ambient sound of wherever Mitchell was, an office probably, the low hum of a building that takes itself seriously. He said, "I have spoken to the attorney about filing a preliminary motion, just to establish the parameters of the estate." I said, "I see." He said, "It does not have to become adversarial. I just think we need clarity." I said, "There is something in the safe, under the bar at the restaurant, Mitchell. Your mother left it there. I think you should see it, before you file anything." He said, "What is it?" I said, "I do not know. She was specific that it was for you, and not for me, which means I have not opened it." A pause. Something shifted in the quality of his silence, though I could not have said precisely what. He said, "I will be there Friday." His voice was different than it had been at the start of the call. The rehearsed edges had been worn down into something less certain and more human. I said, "All right," he said. "Dad, I am not trying to be the villain here." I said, "I know you are not, Mitchell. I know exactly what you are trying to be. I just think you might be going about it the wrong way." He did not respond to that. We said goodbye with the careful courtesy of two people who love each other and are currently, for reasons neither of them has fully articulated, standing on opposite sides of something they have not yet named. I put the phone down on the table and looked out the window of the Millstone Inn, at the covered bridge, and the river moving beneath it in the morning light. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen doorway, read the room in approximately 1.5 seconds, and set a fresh cup of coffee in front of me without a word. I said, "My son is coming Friday." She said, "I will make sure there is enough for 3. I said, "He is bringing his position on the estate." She said, "I will make sure the coffee is strong." I looked at her. She met my eyes with the same steady, patient expression she had worn since the moment she opened the dark green door 3 days ago. The expression of a woman who has been through her own version of this and come out the other side thoughtful rather than hardened. I picked up the fresh coffee. Outside, the river kept moving. Friday was 2 days away, and somewhere under the bar of the Millstone Inn, in a small safe with a combination that was Mitchell's birthday, Grace Ellison was waiting, as patiently as she had waited for everything else, to have the last word. I had 2 days before my son arrived to either make a case for staying or accept that Grace had overestimated me. I considered both options for approximately 4 minutes after I put the phone down. Then I chose a third option. I went into the kitchen and picked up a knife. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. I walked to the knife block on the prep counter, the one with 8 knives in descending order of size, and I took out the chef's knife, the 8-inch one, the kind you reach for first when you are thinking clearly about what you actually need. I held it in my right hand and felt the weight of it, the particular balance of a well-made knife that has been properly maintained. And I stood there for a moment, doing nothing at all. Eleanor was at the other end of the kitchen, doing something with a stock pot that she did not look up from. My hand was not entirely steady. I want to be honest about that. I have held knives in professional kitchens since I was 22 years old, in conditions ranging from the merely chaotic to the genuinely dangerous. And my hands have been, for most of that time, among the more reliable things about me. Standing in the kitchen of the Millstone Inn on a Wednesday morning in July, with a chef's knife in my hand and 12 years of cold stoves behind me, my hand was not entirely steady. I set the knife down, picked it up again, set it down. Eleanor said, from the other end of the kitchen, without looking up, "There is a cutting board on the shelf under the window." I said, "I know where cutting boards are kept." She said, "I was not suggesting otherwise." I got the cutting board. There was a crate of vegetables on the counter that Eleanor had brought in from the delivery that morning. Onions, carrots, celery, a bunch of flat-leaf parsley, 2 heads of garlic, the basic architecture of any number of things, depending on what you decided to build with it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up the knife again and started with an onion. The first cut was too thick. I could feel it before I looked at it. The angle slightly wrong. The pressure distribution not quite right. The particular sensation of a cut made by hands that are out of practice and know it. I looked at the slice on the board. Too thick. I adjusted and made another. Better. Not right, but better. I worked through the onion, then the carrots, then the celery. Eleanor remained at her end of the kitchen and did not watch me, which was exactly the correct thing to do. She moved around her stock pot and checked something in the oven and made a note on the small pad of paper she kept on the shelf above the spice rack, and the kitchen had the particular quality of a shared workspace, where 2 people are doing their own work in proximity without interfering with each other. I had not felt that quality in 12 years. I had forgotten, specifically, how much I missed it. By the time I got to the garlic, my hands were steadier. Not all the way back, but steadier. The muscle memory is a remarkable thing. It does not disappear. It waits. 12 years. And it was still there. Slightly rusty at the edges, like a good knife that has been stored without proper care, but has not been damaged, only neglected, and can be brought back with attention and time. I found a sauté pan, heated it properly, added oil, and started building something simple. A base, onion and garlic and carrot cooked down until they were soft and honest, and smelled the way the beginning of a good meal should smell. Warm and specific and like somewhere you would want to be. Eleanor appeared at my end of the kitchen. She stood beside me and looked at the pan for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Your heat is too high." I said, "My heat is fine," she said. "Your onions are going to color before they are soft enough." I looked at the onions. She was right. I turned the heat down. She said, "The garlic went in too early as well." I said, "I am aware of that." She said, "I am just." I said, "I know. Thank you." She went back to her end of the kitchen. I adjusted the heat and worked the pan and paid attention to what was happening in it the way you pay attention to something you have been away from long enough to remember that it requires your full presence and will not settle for anything less. After 20 minutes, I had the beginning of something that smelled right. Not finished. Not ready to serve to anyone. But structurally sound, which is where everything has to start. I tasted it. Added salt. Tasted again. The salt was right. The balance was almost there. Not quite. Something slightly flat in the middle of the flavor that I could not immediately identify. I said, out loud to myself more than to Eleanor, "It needs acid." Eleanor said, "There is white wine in the rack behind you, and a lemon on the counter to your left." I used the lemon. The flavor opened up immediately. The way flavor always opens when you give it what it was missing, which is one of the things about cooking that has never stopped feeling slightly like magic, regardless of how well you understand the chemistry behind it. I stood back and looked at the pan. Eleanor came to my end of the kitchen again. She dipped a clean spoon into the pan and tasted it with the focused, neutral expression of someone who is actually evaluating rather than performing evaluation. She held the flavor for a moment. Then she said, "The texture of the carrot is slightly uneven. The garlic is good. The acid is right. The salt is correct. Overall, it is better than it should be for a first attempt after 12 years. I said, "That is a very qualified compliment." She said, "I am a very honest person. Grace warned you about that." "I assume." I said, "She used the word direct." Eleanor said, "That is a polite way to put it." She picked up her spoon again and tasted once more. Then she said, "What are you thinking for a menu? If Mitchell is coming Friday, and there are going to be 3 people at the table." I said, "I have not thought that far ahead." She said, "You have 2 days." I would start thinking. I looked at the pan, then at the knife block, then at the 8 burners on the stove, 6 of which I had not touched yet. Then out the window at the covered bridge and the river and the Vermont morning doing what Vermont mornings do with unhurried and complete competence. I said, "She liked pasta. Grace. A simple one. Nothing complicated. Butter and Parmesan and a little black pepper." Eleanor said, "I have pasta flour." I said, "I know how to make pasta." She said, "I know you do. Grace told me about the pasta incident of 2009, which I gather was formative." I said, "That is not what I would call it." She said, "What would you call it?" I thought about it. I said, "A learning experience that produced excellent pasta." Eleanor smiled. "The real kind." She picked up her notepad from the shelf above the spice rack and wrote something down. Then she looked up and said, "Pasta Friday. What else?" I picked up the chef's knife again. This time my hand was steady. Thursday began the way good working days begin, which is to say early and without ceremony. I was at the Millstone Inn by 6:30, which was becoming, without any formal discussion, the time I arrived. Eleanor was already in the kitchen when I got there, her canvas apron on, her hair pulled back, a cup of coffee waiting on the counter at my station. Not my station yet, technically, but that was what it was becoming. And we both understood that without saying it. We had work to do before Friday, and we did it. The dining room needed attention. The tables were pushed toward the walls in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was and discouraged the kind of conversation that happens when people are close enough to feel the warmth of a shared meal without being crowded. I moved 3 tables. Eleanor moved 2. We stood at opposite ends of the room and made small adjustments until the arrangement was right, the way two people calibrate a shared space when they have different but compatible instincts about how a room should feel. She was good at this. I had spent 30 years thinking about how a kitchen should function and considerably less time thinking about how a dining room should feel. And Eleanor thought about both with equal attention. She had an eye for the small things, the angle of a chair, the distance between a table and the window that determined whether the light fell on the food or on the faces of the people eating it. Grace had said she was the real thing. Watching Eleanor straighten a table setting with the focused care of someone who understood that details are not small things but the thing itself, I understood what Grace had meant. We worked through the morning. The windows needed cleaning, which I did while Eleanor restocked the bar and checked the wine inventory. The small chalkboard menu near the entrance needed updating, which Eleanor did in handwriting considerably better than mine. I reorganized the knife station in the kitchen because the previous arrangement was not the one I would have chosen, and Eleanor watched me without comment, which I took as acceptance. At noon, we sat at the table by the window and ate lunch from what I had built that morning. The base from the delivery vegetables developed now into something more complete. Eleanor ate with attention and said, "This is significantly better than yesterday." I said, "Yesterday was the first attempt." She said, "I know. I am noting the improvement." I said, "Are you always this sparing with compliments?" She said, "I am always this accurate with them." There is a difference. I thought about Grace, who had been the same way. Accurate rather than generous with praise, which meant that when she said something was good, you believed her completely. I did not say this out loud, but I thought it. After lunch, I sat on the front steps and called Carol. She picked up on the second ring, with the alert energy of a woman who had been waiting for this call without admitting it. She said, "Tom, where on earth are you?" I said, "Vermont. I found what Grace left me." A pause. Then Carol said, "Well, tell me." I told her about the restaurant, about Eleanor, about the letter and the 8 pages and the knife block, and the first morning I had stood at the stove and not turned it on, and the second morning I had turned it on and then off again, and the third morning I had picked up a chef's knife and started with an onion. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You cooked." I said, "I cooked. Not well yet, but I cooked." She said, "Tom Ellison." She said my full name, the way you say a full name when the name itself is the whole sentence. Then she said, "Grace knew exactly what she was doing." I said, "She always did." Carol said, "Is this woman Eleanor? Is she good people?" I thought about the coffee timed exactly right, and the scrambled eggs, and the way Eleanor had stood at her end of the kitchen and not watched me struggle with the onion and the accurate, rather than generous compliments and the notepad, where she had written Pasta Friday in careful handwriting. I said, "She is very good people." Carol said, "Good. That is good, Tom." We talked for 10 more minutes about nothing in particular. The easy conversation of two people comfortable with the texture of each other's ordinary days. When we hung up, I sat on the steps a while longer and watched a family of tourists walk past, the children slightly ahead of the parents, the way children always are, pulling the family forward into whatever comes next. I went back inside. The evening was quiet. Eleanor made dinner for the two of us, lake trout done simply with butter and herbs and a restraint that let the fish be what it was without improving on it. We sat at the table by the window as the light outside went from gold to amber to the particular blue that Vermont evenings have in July, the blue that suggests the day has been satisfied with itself and is now setting things down carefully. We talked about the menu for Friday. We talked about suppliers and the reasons Eleanor used some and not others. We talked about the covered bridge, which she told me had been built in 1872 and survived 2 floods and one very ambitious truck driver who had underestimated its clearance. We talked about David, briefly, and about Grace, briefly, in the way two people talk about the ones they have lost when the place feels safe enough for it. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor put on her jacket and said goodnight. I watched her headlights sweep across the parking lot and disappear down the side street. I washed the dishes. I turned off the kitchen lights one by one. I stood in the dark dining room and looked at the 12 tables with their white linens and their wooden chairs arranged the way we had arranged them that morning. The street lamp light coming through the window and falling across the nearest table in a way that was, in the Vermont quiet, unexpectedly beautiful. Then I went back to the motel and set my alarm for 5:40. I lay in the dark and thought about Grace, who had planned all of this 14 months ago from a table in this very restaurant and had gotten every detail right down to the combination of the safe. Then I thought about Mitchell, who would be here in the morning with his suit and his position on the estate, and the particular expression of a man who has decided how he is going to manage a situation. I thought about the safe under the bar, about the envelope inside it with Mitchell's name on the front in Grace's handwriting. I closed my eyes. Outside, Vermont was very quiet. And in the morning, the parking lot of the Millstone Inn would have one more car in it than it did tonight. My son stepped out of a rental car in a suit on a Friday morning in Vermont, and I thought, Grace, you knew exactly what you were doing when you picked this town. Nobody wears a suit in Woodstock, Vermont on a Friday morning in July. The tourists wear linen and sensible shoes. The locals wear whatever they wore yesterday. Mitchell stepped out of his silver sedan in a charcoal suit with a white shirt and no tie, which in any other context would have been casual. But here, against the backdrop of the birch trees and the stone wall and the hand-painted sign above the dark green door, looked like a verdict that had driven up from New York and was prepared to deliver itself. I watched him from the kitchen window. He stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the Millstone Inn, with the evaluating expression of a man who is accustomed to assessing things quickly and has already begun. He looked at the sign. He looked at the parking lot. He looked at the stone wall and the birch trees. Then he picked up a leather portfolio from the back seat, closed the car door, and walked toward the entrance. Eleanor was at the stove behind me. I said, "He is here," she said. I heard the car. "How does he look?" I said, like a verdict. She said, "I will make more coffee." I went out to the dining room to meet him. Mitchell came through the dark green door and stopped just inside. The way people stop when they are taking in a room they had not expected to find themselves in. He looked at the 12 tables with their white linens. He looked at the exposed brick walls and the photographs in the wide plank floor worn smooth in the paths between tables. He looked at the open kitchen at the far end, and at Eleanor behind the counter, and then he looked at me. He said, "Dad," I said. "Mitchell, you made good time." He said, "Left the city at 5. He said it the way people say things that are meant to establish something, though I was not entirely sure what. Effort, perhaps, or the seriousness of the occasion. I said, "Come in. Sit down." Eleanor made coffee. He crossed the room and shook Eleanor's hand across the counter, with the practiced efficiency of a man who shakes hands many times a day and has reduced it to something entirely mechanical. He said, "Eleanor, nice to meet you." He said it pleasantly and without warmth, which is its own particular skill. Eleanor said, "Mr. Ellison, can I get you something?" He said, "Just water. Thank you." He had already turned back toward me. We sat at a table near the center of the room, which was not the table by the window where I usually sat with Eleanor, and I noticed I had chosen it deliberately, some instinct toward neutral ground. Mitchell set his leather portfolio on the table beside his water glass and looked around the room again. He said, "It is smaller than I expected." I said, 12 tables. It is the right size for what it is." He said, "And what is it exactly?" "Practically speaking." I said, "It is a restaurant, Mitchell." He said, "Dad." He said it with patience, the particular patience of someone who believes they are the only adult in the room. "I know it is a restaurant. I am asking what the plan is. Operationally, you have not cooked professionally in 12 years. The property needs investment. The local market in a town this size has real limitations. I have looked at the numbers, and they are not. I said, "You looked at the numbers." He said, "I had someone look at the numbers." "Yes," I said. "Before you came up here, you had someone look at the numbers on a restaurant your mother bought and left to me." He said, "I am trying to protect you." There it was again. That phrase. I looked at my son across the table. He was 39 years old, and he was wearing a charcoal suit on a Friday morning in Vermont, and he had driven up from New York at 5 in the morning to protect me. I understood, looking at him, that he meant it. That was the complicated part. He was not performing concern. He was expressing it in the only language he had, which was the language of numbers and legal structures and the careful management of risk, because that was what he had spent his entire adult life learning to do, and he was good at it, and it had never once occurred to him that it was not the right tool for every situation. I said, "I know you are." He opened the leather portfolio. Inside was a set of documents, neatly organized, tabbed with small colored markers. He said, "Gerald Harmon filed a response to my attorney's preliminary inquiry yesterday." He set 2 pages on the table between us. I have reviewed it, and there are some issues with the way the asset was structured that I think we need to address before we make any decisions about the property going forward. I looked at the documents on the table. I did not pick them up. I said, "Mitchell, before we go any further with any of this, there is something I need to show you." He said, "Dad, I really think we should go through these first." I said, "I understand, but there is a safe under the bar. Your mother left something in it. I have not opened it because she was specific that it was for you. I think you should see it before anything else." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not the evaluating expression and was not the practiced patience. Something that belonged to an earlier version of Mitchell, the one who used to sit on the kitchen counter at the house on Trad Street and watch me cook and ask questions about everything, with the particular energy of a child who believes the world is full of things worth understanding. He said, "She left something for me." I said, "She left something for you." He looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was at the far end of the kitchen, doing something at the stove, with the focused attention of a woman who is very deliberately not listening. Then he looked back at me. He said, "All right." I stood up. He picked up his water glass and followed me behind the bar, to the low door of the storage room, and inside, to the small safe mounted on the wall beneath the shelves. I said, "The combination is your birthday, month, day, year." Mitchell looked at the safe for a moment. Then he crouched down and entered the combination with steady hands, and the door swung open. The combination was Mitchell's birthday. Of course it was. Grace never did anything by accident, and she certainly never chose a combination by accident. She had picked the one number in the world that Mitchell would enter without hesitation, the one that would open the door before he had time to think too carefully about what he was doing or why he was doing it. That was Grace. She understood the architecture of a moment, as well as she understood everything else. The safe was not large. A standard wall safe, the kind that fits a document folder and a few smaller items without difficulty. Inside, exactly as she had described in her letter, there were 2 things. The first was a document folder, the expandable kind, secured with a brown elastic band. On the outside, in Grace's handwriting, it said, "Gerald Harmon, Esquire, Millstone Inn Estate Documentation." The second was a small white envelope, plain, sealed, with Mitchell written on the front in Grace's looping cursive. I reached in and took out both. I handed the folder to Mitchell and held the envelope. He looked at the envelope in my hand. I said, "This is yours. I will give it to you when you have read the folder." She was specific about the order. He looked at me for a moment, and something in his expression said he wanted to argue about it. And then something else said he had decided not to. He took the folder. We went back out to the dining room and sat at the center table. Mitchell removed the elastic band and opened the folder. Inside were 15 pages, printed and tabbed, with a cover sheet that identified the document as a comprehensive estate declaration prepared by Gerald Harmon, attorney at law, Burlington, Vermont, on behalf of Grace Ann Ellison. Mitchell read with the focused efficiency of a man trained to process legal documents quickly, his eyes moving steadily down each page, his face neutral, in the particular way that faces are neutral when the person wearing them is working hard to keep them that way. I sat across from him and did not speak. Eleanor appeared briefly at the kitchen door, read the room, and disappeared again. The dining room was very quiet. Outside, through the front window, a couple walked past on the sidewalk with a dog, the ordinary Friday morning of a town that had no particular interest in the Ellison family's complications. Mitchell turned pages. On page 4 he stopped briefly, reread something, and turned on. On page 7 he set the folder down, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then picked it up again. I watched his jaw. It was my jaw. The same jaw I saw in the mirror every morning. And it had the particular set of a jaw that is working to keep a face composed when the face would prefer to be doing something else. On page 11, the document addressed what Grace had described in her letter as possible complications. The language was Gerald Harmon's, which is to say precise and unhurried, and constructed to be read only one way. It stated that in the event of a legal challenge to the estate by any family member, the full balance of the restaurant's assessed value would be directed to the Grace Ann Ellison Culinary Scholarship Fund, administered by the Vermont Community Foundation, with the property title transferring unconditionally to Thomas James Ellison regardless of the outcome of any such challenge. Mitchell read that page twice. I knew because I counted. On page 15, the last page, there was a handwritten addition at the bottom, below Gerald Harmon's signature and notary seal. It was in Grace's handwriting, the same looping cursive she had used for everything her whole life. Steady and deliberate and completely itself. It said, "Mitchell, I know you. You mean well. You have always meant well, even when you were going about it in the way most likely to cause everyone around you additional stress. I am not criticizing you for it. I am simply asking you to trust me one more time, the way you used to trust me when you were small and the world was confusing, and you would come find me in the kitchen because you knew I would either fix it or explain why it did not need fixing. I have fixed this. You do not need to manage it. All I need from you is to let your father have this. That is the whole of it. Love, Mom." Mitchell read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set the folder down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone setting something down that they do not want to drop. And he put both hands flat on the table, and he looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. I did not say anything. Some moments require silence, the way a kitchen requires heat, as the condition, without which nothing useful can happen. After a while, Mitchell said, "She wrote that about trusting her the way I used to when I was small." I said, "She did." He said, "She knew I would need to hear it like that." I said, "She knew exactly what she was doing. She always did." He picked up his water glass and set it down again without drinking. Then he said, "And she prepared for this. She had Gerald prepare all of this specifically in case I." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The folder on the table finished it for him. I said, 14 months ago, Mitchell. She did all of this 14 months ago." He looked at the folder. He looked at the front window and the street beyond it. Then he looked at me, and for a moment, under the suit and the leather portfolio and the colored tabs and the attorney's preliminary inquiry, I saw my son, the one who used to sit on the kitchen counter and ask questions about everything with the energy of a child who believed the world was full of things worth understanding. He was still in there. He had just been, for the past several weeks, buried under the weight of his own version of grief, which happened to look, from the outside, almost exactly like control. I held out the small white envelope with his name on the front. His hand, when he reached out to take it, was not entirely steady. He looked at his name in his mother's handwriting for a long moment. Then he looked up at me and said, "I think I need to read this alone." I said, "I know. Take your time." I stood up, picked up my coffee cup, and walked to the front door of the Millstone Inn. I stepped outside into the Vermont morning and sat down on the front steps and looked at the covered bridge at the end of the street and the river moving beneath it and the mountains beyond the town, sitting with their usual magnificent indifference to the affairs of the people at their feet. Inside, my son was reading a letter from his mother. I waited. I sat on the front steps of the Millstone Inn and watched the mountains. In Woodstock, Vermont, the mountains do not demand your attention. They simply exist at the edges of everything, green and unhurried and permanent, in a way that makes the temporary nature of human problems feel, if not insignificant, then at least proportionate. I had lived my whole life in Charleston, flat and coastal, oriented entirely toward the water, and I had not understood until this week that I had been missing something by never living somewhere with mountains on the horizon. I thought about Mitchell when he was small. He had been a serious child, observant in the way children are when they are trying to understand a world that does not yet make sense. He used to come into the kitchen on weekend mornings when I was cooking and sit on the counter beside the stove and watch. Not talking, mostly. Just watching. He would ask occasional questions, specific ones. Why does the butter do that? What makes bread rise? What happens if you add too much salt? And I would explain, and he would nod with the focused gravity of a 7-year-old filing information away for future use. Grace used to stand in the kitchen doorway on those mornings with her coffee, wearing the expression she wore when she was happy in a way she did not feel the need to announce. She was not a woman who announced her contentment. She just wore it quietly. And if you were paying attention, you could see it. I had been paying attention. For 31 years, I had been paying attention. I wondered what Grace had written to Mitchell. I had not read it because she told me not to, and I had learned over 31 years that when Grace said something directly, it was worth taking seriously. But I thought about what she might have said. She had always known Mitchell in a way I admired and occasionally envied, understood the specific architecture of his anxieties and his ambitions, and where the two intersected and caused him trouble. She had never tried to fix him. She had just known him, completely and without agenda. Whatever was in that letter, she had known exactly what he needed to hear. The door behind me opened at 23 minutes. I know because I had been watching the time. Mitchell sat down on the step beside me. Not across from me, not at a remove, but beside me. The way he used to sit on the back porch of the house on Trad Street when he was young, and something had happened at school that he did not know how to talk about yet and needed to be near another person while he figured it out. He had the envelope in his hand. Open. The letter folded back inside carefully. The way you fold something you are going to keep. We did not speak for a while. The mountains sat where they had been sitting for considerably longer than either of us, and would continue long after both of us were gone, which is either comforting or unsettling depending on the day. Today felt like the comforting kind. After a while, Mitchell said, "She said I got her stubbornness and your silence, and that the combination in a grieving person is more dangerous than either one alone." I said, "That sounds right." He said, "She said she knew I would come up here to stop it, that she was not angry about it, that it was exactly what she would have done in my position, which she said was the problem." I said, "She was very self-aware." He said, "She said, you needed this place the way some people need water. That it was not about the restaurant as a business. It was about having somewhere specific to go back to, a kitchen that was yours." I did not say anything to that. He was right, and we both knew it, and saying so would not have added anything. Mitchell turned the envelope over in his hands. Then he said, "She also said something about Eleanor." I waited. He said, "She said she had not chosen Eleanor for you. She was careful about that distinction. She said she had found Eleanor and introduced the idea of her, and that the rest was entirely up to both of you, and that she trusted you to figure out what that meant without her supervision." I said, "That sounds exactly like her." He said. She also said something else. He paused. He was looking at the mountains now. She said, Mitchell, your father has spent 31 years making sure everyone around him was taken care of. It is time someone returned the favor. I have done what I can from here. The rest is yours. The step was quiet. I said, she said that, he said in her handwriting, with a period at the end, which she used when she meant something to be final. I looked at my son. He was 39 years old in a charcoal suit that was slightly out of place, and his eyes were red in the way eyes are red when someone has been crying alone with enough dignity to finish before coming outside. He had his mother's eyes and my jaw, and he was, I realized, not managing a situation at all. He was just a person who had lost his mother and had not, until this morning, fully allowed himself to know it. I said, she was something. He said, yeah, she really was. Quietly. Not the boardroom voice. The other one. The one from the kitchen counter, 30 years ago. We sat without speaking for another few minutes. Then Mitchell looked at the leather portfolio visible through the front window. And then he looked at me. And something shifted in his face that I had not seen since before Grace got sick. Something that was not management or assessment or the careful calculation of options. Something simpler than all of that. He said, show me the kitchen, Dad. Not to appraise it. Not to assess it. I could hear the difference. I had been listening to this person for 39 years, and I knew every register of his voice, and this one was the one from the kitchen counter. I stood up and held the door open. He walked inside. That evening, for the first time since Grace's funeral, I cooked for someone other than myself. I cooked for my son and a woman my wife had chosen, in a kitchen my wife had bought, in a town my wife had fallen in love with before I even knew it existed. I made pasta, the simple kind, butter and Parmesan and a little black pepper, the way Grace had always wanted it on Friday evenings when the week had been long and what was needed was not complexity but care. I made it from scratch, the flour and the eggs and the rolling and the cutting, all of it the way I had not made it in 12 years, and my hands remembered every part of it without being asked. Mitchell stood at the kitchen entrance and watched me work. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, which I had not seen him do in years, and he stood with his arms crossed and his shoulder against the doorframe in the exact posture he had used at 7 years old sitting on the kitchen counter. I did not point this out. Some observations are better kept. Eleanor moved around him with the easy efficiency of someone accustomed to sharing a kitchen, handing me things before I asked for them, tasting the butter sauce with a clean spoon, and adding a small amount of salt that I acknowledged was correct without saying so out loud. Mitchell watched the two of us work together, and was quiet in the particular way of someone who is revising an assessment they had already made. At some point he said, "You two have done this before." Eleanor said, "We have had a few days." He said, "How many?" She said, "Enough to know he puts too much pepper." I said, "The pepper is correct." Eleanor looked at Mitchell. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was the beginning of an understanding. Quiet and unhurried. The kind that does not announce itself. We ate at the table by the window. 3 places set. White linen. The simple wooden chairs. The Vermont evening coming through the glass in the particular shade of gold that belongs to July, at this latitude when the day has finally decided to let go of the heat without letting go of the light. I had lit the 2 candles on the table because Grace would have lit them, and because a table set for 3 on a Friday evening in a restaurant that is just beginning to understand what it is deserves candlelight. The pasta was good. Not perfect, not yet, but honest and carefully made, and exactly what it was supposed to be. Mitchell ate with genuine attention, the way he had eaten as a child before he learned to eat at business dinners, which is a different activity entirely. He asked Eleanor how long she had been in Woodstock. She told him 11 years, since David's work brought them north and then David was gone and Vermont had already become home by then, so she had stayed. He asked about the restaurant, how she had run it before Grace, what the regulars were like, whether the tourist season was as significant as he imagined. She answered everything directly. without performing anything. And he listened the way he had listened to me on the kitchen counter 30 years ago, with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than evaluate. At one point, Eleanor said something about Grace. A small story about the second weekend they had spent together, when Grace had insisted on helping rearrange the storage room and had done it with such systematic efficiency that Eleanor had found things she had been looking for since 2 winters ago. Mitchell listened to the story and then made a sound that was a laugh. Short, real, the kind that comes out before you have decided to let it. He said, "That is exactly what she did to my apartment when I moved to New York. I found my college diploma in a box labeled current documents," Eleanor said. "She told me about that," he said. "She told you about my apartment?" Eleanor said. "She told me about most things. She was thorough." Mitchell shook his head slowly, and he was still almost smiling. And it was the most like himself he had seemed all day, the self that existed before the suit and the leather portfolio and the attorney's preliminary inquiry. We finished the pasta. Eleanor brought out a small cheese plate she had put together from what was in the refrigerator, the kind of ending to a meal that is better than dessert because it asks nothing of you except to keep sitting there, which is what all 3 of us wanted to do. The evening went dark outside the window. The street lamp came on, throwing its circle of yellow light onto the sidewalk. The candles on the table burned down a little. Inside the Millstone Inn, the 12 tables with their white linens were lit warmly and the kitchen was clean, and the 3 of us sat at the table by the window and did not hurry toward whatever came next. After a while, Mitchell looked across the table at Eleanor. Then he looked at me. He said, "Is there something here, Dad? Between you and Eleanor?" I said, "Your mother knew her." She approved. He was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly by the stem. Then he nodded once. Slowly. The nod of someone who is incorporating new information into an existing picture and finding that it fits better than expected. He said, "Of course she did." He looked out the window at the dark street, at the covered bridge, just visible at the far end where the street lamp light reached. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "She planned all of this, didn't she?" It was not quite a question. I said, "Down to the reservation." He looked at the candles. Then at the kitchen behind me, at the stove with its 8 burners, and the copper pots, and the knife block with its 8 knives. Then back at me. He said, "She knew you would stop cooking when she got sick. And she knew you would not start again on your own." I said, "She knew me very well." He said, "Yeah." He looked at the table. "She knew me pretty well, too." The restaurant was quiet. The evening was quiet. Outside, somewhere beyond the covered bridge, Vermont was settling into the particular stillness of a Friday night in a small town that has made its peace with itself. Mitchell picked up his wine glass. I picked up mine. Eleanor picked up hers. We did not make a toast. We did not need to. We just sat there, the 3 of us, in the light of a restaurant that Grace Ellison had bought with cash on a Friday evening 14 months ago from a woman she had just met, because she had looked at all the available evidence and made a decision, the way she always did, before anyone else in the room had finished thinking about it. Mitchell left at 9:30. He shook my hand at the door, which is how we have always said goodbye. The 2 of us. A handshake with a brief grip that means more than it looks like it means. Then he looked at Eleanor, who had come to the doorway of the kitchen, and he said, "Thank you for dinner." He said it simply, without the mechanical efficiency of the handshake he had given her that morning. This was a different kind of thank you, the kind that includes the whole evening in it. "Not just the pasta," Eleanor said. "Come back when you can stay longer." He said, "I will." And he meant it. I could tell because Mitchell, whatever his other qualities, has never been a man who says things he does not mean. He gets that. From Grace. I watched his headlights sweep across the parking lot and disappear down the side street. The sound of the engine faded. And then there was just the Vermont night, which is a very particular kind of quiet. the kind that does not feel empty but full of cricket sound and river sound, and the breathing of old trees, and the particular satisfaction of a place that has been itself for a very long time. Eleanor came and stood beside me at the door. We looked at the parking lot, and the birch trees, and the stone wall beyond them for a moment. Then she said, "He is going to be all right." I said, "I know." He just needed to hear it from her one more time. Eleanor said, "She knew that too." I said, "She knew everything." Eleanor smiled. "Not the polite kind. The real kind. The one that uses her whole face." Then she said, "I am going to finish cleaning the kitchen. You should go sit on the porch." I said, "I can help with the kitchen." She said, "Tom, go sit on the porch." I went and sat on the porch. The porch of the Millstone Inn is a small thing, 4 wooden chairs and a railing, overlooking the side street and the stone wall, and beyond that the birch trees standing in the darkness with their white bark, catching what little light there was. I sat in the chair closest to the window and looked out at the town, Woodstock, Vermont, on a Friday night in July, is the kind of quiet that Charleston never quite achieves. Charleston has its own beauty, its own particular music of the late evening, the harbor sounds and the church bells, and the way the heat stays in the streets after dark, like something that has decided to keep you company. I have loved that city my whole life. I have walked its streets for 64 years. But sitting on this porch, in this quiet, I understood something I had not understood before. Grace had not just left me a restaurant. She had left me a way of seeing what was possible, a demonstration, executed with her usual thoroughness, that the life you have lived is not the only version of the life available to you, that there are rooms you have not been in yet, and kitchens you have not cooked in yet, and people you have not sat with yet, in the particular quiet of a summer evening, in a town you did not know existed until someone who loved you decided you needed to know. She had understood that about me, that I would not find those rooms on my own, that I needed someone to open the door and leave a note on the table and stock the kitchen and arrange for a woman named Eleanor Quinn to be standing at the stove when I arrived. She had understood that, and she had done something about it, which was the most Grace thing it was possible to do. Eleanor came out after a while and sat in the chair beside me. She had taken off her apron. She held a small glass of wine, and she sat with the ease of someone who has earned her stillness through considerable effort and knows how to use it. We did not speak for a while. The street was empty. The covered bridge was a dark shape at the far end, just visible. Somewhere beyond the town, beyond the mountains, the stars were doing what stars do, which is exist at a scale that puts everything else in perspective without trying to. After a while, Eleanor said, quietly, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking about a woman who bought a restaurant in Vermont with cash because she loved me and knew me well enough to know I would need somewhere to go when she was gone." Eleanor said, "She was remarkable." I said, "She was the most remarkable person I have ever known. And I knew her for 31 years, which means I had more time than most people get, and I still did not get enough." Eleanor said, "No, you never do." We sat with that for a while. The kind of sitting with something that does not try to resolve it, just holds it, the way a good kitchen holds the smell of a meal, long after the meal is finished. I looked through the window of the Millstone Inn at the kitchen inside. Eleanor had left the light on over the stove, the way you leave a light on when you want a place to look like someone is home. The 8 burners were cold now, the copper pots still, the knife block on the counter with its 8 knives in descending order. But the light was on, warm and steady and specific, the way a light is when someone left it on for a reason. I said, out loud, "To nobody and to somebody, Grace. I got your reservation. I am here." The Vermont night did not answer. It never does. But Eleanor reached over without looking at me and set her hand on the arm of my chair. Not on my hand, just on the arm, the way you place something carefully in a spot where it might be needed. and left it there. I looked at the kitchen light. I thought about a woman who had loved me well enough to plan my future from a kitchen table 14 months before I needed it, who had found me a friend in a small restaurant in Vermont, who had prepared 17 pages of legal documentation and a handwritten letter for my son and a combination lock set to his birthday and a note in my letter that said simply, "Now go turn on the stove," who had understood, better than I understood myself, that what I needed was not comfort but direction. Not to be held in place, but to be pointed somewhere and trusted to find my way there. I thought about the stove, about the blue flame coming up clean and steady the first morning. I turned it on, and then off again. About the pasta I had made that evening, from scratch, with hands that remembered everything they had been taught. About Mitchell sitting at the table by the window with his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, making a sound that was a real laugh. The first real laugh I had heard from him since before Grace got sick. I thought about all of it, and I said nothing. Because some things do not need to be said out loud to be completely true. And then Eleanor said, very quietly, "It is a good place, Tom." She chose well. I looked at the kitchen light one more time. Then I looked at the birch trees, their white bark pale in the darkness, standing the way birch trees stand, which is together and without particular drama, and for a very long time. I said yes. She really did. We sat there until the wine was gone and the street was fully dark, and the Vermont night had settled completely into itself. And I did not go anywhere. And I did not want to.